Good afternoon, rainy though it is. I'm Marc Pachter, the Interim Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the first ever Embassy Jazz Day, which is subtitled Crossing Borders, Bridging Cultures, which is, of course, at the core of why we're doing this. This will be a signal event every year to come as well. And I'd also like to welcome you to our Warner Brothers Theater, which has capacities that are so extraordinary that I'd have to kill you if I told you. It's just amazing what we can do here. So this is a perfect brand new venue for this brand new event. The panel discussion and jazz performances today will showcase how jazz unites us and will give us a glimpse of the future of jazz around the world. This program is being webcast, and I want to extend a greeting to those tuning in across the globe and to welcome and thank all of the diplomatic representatives who are with us in the audience here in Washington, D.C. And, of course, we welcome the co-host of this celebration, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizational Affairs, Esther Brimmer, and the Smithsonian's Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture, my boss, Richard Kurin. Always applaud the people who supply support. JAM, which is what we call Jazz Appreciation Month, and the events of this month would not be possible without the generous support of our donors. Several are represented here today. Representing the Argus Fund, our lead donor is Mr. Marc. Our longtime recording industry supporter, BMI Music, represented by Mr. Fred Cannon, and the National Park Service, which also, like the Smithsonian, gets the importance of jazz in America. With us today from the National Park Service is Superintendent Alex Romero. Unable to be with us, but whose support is equally appreciated, and the name alone leads to appreciation, is the Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation and Radio 1. So she's blessing us wherever she is. Many of our JAM partners and volunteers are here, and please give a round of applause to the amazing staff who put together all the components of this soon-to-be annual celebration. When the museum established Jazz Appreciation Month in 2001, bizarrely, I was acting director at that point as well. So I helped inaugurate the first celebration when I was acting director. Jazz is one of my passions, so it was an easy thing to embrace, and I'm thrilled that 11 years later, it's become the important national and international event it is. We were only hoping at that point that the entire nation would celebrate with us. A decade later, the whole world is celebrating. Every state in the District of Columbia and some 40 countries that we know of are celebrating Jazz Appreciation Month. So that's a success. On April 30th, UNESCO will launch the first International Jazz Day, and in celebration, we have come together in the first ever Embassy Jazz Day. What this global recognition tells us about the impact of jazz is that it is no longer solely an American export, proud of it as we are. Our musical contribution to the world has become an import as well. Musicians and cultures around the world have added their distinct sounds and stories to jazz and have made jazz a global communicator. This is a musical gift that keeps on giving and receiving across borders and cultures. We will get a chance to hear the cultural influences on jazz during the performance part of the program. Now, here at the National Museum of American History, we strive to tell the nation's story in all of its diversity. One of the richest stories we tell is that of jazz, a musical thread that weaves together musical traditions and cultures from everywhere, but is at its heart, and let's remember this, an African-American gift to the world. The Smithsonian operates the world's most comprehensive set of jazz programs. Our museum is home to 100,000 pages of unpublished music composed by Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald's archives, and then we've got a battered cornet that Louis Armstrong is believed to have learned to play on, Dizzy Gillespie's angled trumpet, Benny Goodman's clarinet, the manuscript for John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, and treasures from Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, and so many others. So, to tell you more about the Smithsonian and the work we do across our many museums, research centers, and through program partnership to present jazz year-round, please welcome our Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture, Richard Kurin.
Well, thank you, Marc, and on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution, it's a real pleasure to welcome you, members of the Diplomatic Corps, State Department colleagues, other distinguished guests and visitors. It's a pretty dreary and rainy day out there, outside in America's capital city, but we have a special opportunity to enjoy cool, upbeat jazz inside America's warm National Museum. For decades, the Smithsonian has preserved and celebrated jazz through the acquisition of artifacts and instruments, and as you heard Marc Pachter say, things ranging from the Duke Ellington collection to Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet. But we also have hundreds and hundreds of recordings and scores of oral history of jazz musicians that really tell that story, first person and direct, about the people that made jazz history. We've produced exhibitions, performances, educational materials, and broadcasts to showcase the creativity and vitality of this art form in American life, and again, as Marc Pachter says, in world culture. The historic, Grammy-winning, double platinum Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz that many of us remember when we were a few decades younger was really the watershed mark in our understanding, scholarship, public education, and outreach about jazz. And now, just recently, we've released on Smithsonian Folkways a wonderful box set called Jazz, the Smithsonian Anthology, that again helps us set a new standard for jazz research and education. Again, as we know, jazz originated out of that wonderful cultural bouillabaisse, as our curators write, of New Orleans. Certainly building upon that African base and African-American base, but also reflecting the cultural mix of New Orleans and the Caribbean at that time, European, Native, Caribbean, and Latin influences. It's thus no surprise to hear what Marc Pachter says about jazz employing and enjoying widespread appreciation. 40, 50 years ago, during the Cold War, jazz became really a metaphor for freedom of expression. It was a form of cultural diplomacy that influenced people around the globe. And it stood for the idea of me making my music, my voice being heard, being able to create. Very powerful message. And now in an age of globalization, jazz has become increasingly internationalized, a fact recognized that in this version of the Smithsonian's Jazz Anthology, we have selections of jazz from around the world. Now, when we launched the Jazz Appreciation Month in 2001, we did it to try to recognize America's jazz as America's original music, and of course as a global cultural treasure. And so we're very proud to proceed with the celebration of that month, not only in the United States and across the United States, but across the world, and of course through this Embassy Jazz Day in Washington, D.C. We're especially proud that, I guess next week, or UNESCO will add another dimension to this recognition with the launch of International Jazz Day and the designation of Herbie Hancock as Goodwill Ambassador, who will spread the word about jazz. And I would note that Mr. Hancock's cordless keyboard is currently on display in this museum. So we expect this program with UNESCO to inspire creativity and intercultural dialogue among world youth. And the Smithsonian is really proud to join our partners at the U.S. State Department and at UNESCO in celebrating jazz as a form of cultural heritage that crosses boundaries and builds bridges between people the world over. Now it's My pleasure to begin our celebration by introducing you to a State Department leader whose vision helped make Embassy Jazz Day at the Smithsonian reality. Dr. Esther Brimmer, Assistant Secretary of International Organization Affairs at the U.S. State Department. In her role, she represents U.S. interests through international organizations in areas such as human rights, peacekeeping, food security, humanitarian relief, and climate change. These are all vitally important. But today, we literally get to jazz all that up. So please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Esther Brimmer.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here to welcome you and to say a warm thanks to the Smithsonian as well. A particular thanks to both to the acting director, Marc Pachter. We very much appreciate the close cooperation between the Department of State and the Smithsonian, and of course to Undersecretary Richard Kurin, who's always been very much a strong supporter of the international efforts on art and diplomacy. And again, I salute you and thank you. And to all of our guests, the intrepid guests who made it through the weather, thank you. And a special thanks to all the people who worked hard to make this happen, and a warm, particular welcome to our diplomatic community. I am enormously pleased and proud to be with you today to celebrate jazz and to take a moment to mark the important role it has played in U.S. cultural diplomacy and the role that Washington, D.C. itself has played in the history of jazz. This inaugural Embassy Jazz Day event, held during Jazz Appreciation Month, JAM, and just over a week before the inaugural International Jazz Day, offers us the opportunity to acknowledge the unique place jazz occupies in global music, as you've already heard, and its unique role in creating linkages between peoples, communities, and cultures. Indeed, more than 50 years ago, the Department of State launched Jazz Diplomacy, featuring international tours by American musical legends such as Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie. These tours introduced millions across the world to jazz and fueled an explosion of interest in American music and culture. In the subsequent decades, jazz has been continuing to highlight really a real central part of cultural engagement programs, a fact that was recently punctuated by the appointment of jazz great Herbie Hancock as UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador. With his strong encouragement and enthusiastic support from nations across the globe, International Jazz Day was created by UNESCO just a few months ago and will be marked with celebrations and musical events in every corner of the globe on April 30th. So, here today, the State Department and the Smithsonian Institution join to get a head start on those events, and we do so in the very particular context of Washington, D.C. And as a Washingtonian, I'm particularly glad that we're noting the role of the city of Washington in the history of jazz. This context, of course, has a diplomatic character, but it does reflect the important role of this city as a center of American musical innovation. D.C. has been a jazz hotbed for decades and was home to great jazz greats like Duke Ellington, Shirley Horn, and Jelly Roll Morton, and Lena Horne. It continues to be a source of great music and great musicians, a few of whom are up and coming and will perform here today. So on behalf of the Department of State, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to applaud your interest in jazz and the unifying force it represents. And I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Walter Ray Watson, your moderator for today's panel discussion on jazz and cultural diplomacy. I'm senior producer at NPR, National Public Radio, based here in Washington, D.C. My day job involves producing news and information for more than 2 decades, and one of the privileges beyond work on current events and breaking news stories I've followed, reported, and produced stories on jazz music, one of my deep passions. From historical figures to the established and cutting-edge artists of our time. It's my pleasure to participate in this conversation, and not only to think about the impact of American artists as cultural ambassadors who carry this valuable export to the world, but to consider how the favor is being returned with vitality, with new voices, accents, and stories, growing both audience and tradition far beyond its birthplace. I'm pleased now to introduce our panelists, John Hasse, Richard Burgess, and Felix Contreras. First, we have John Hasse. Since 1984, Mr. Hasse has served as curator of American music here at the National Museum of American History, where he founded the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra, and Jazz Appreciation Month, now celebrated in all 50 states and 40 countries. He's the author of Beyond Category, The Life and Genius of Duke Ellington. He's also editor of Jazz the First Century, co-author of Discover Jazz, and co-author of Jazz, the Smithsonian Anthology, which we've previously heard about. He's earned a doctorate, an honorary doctorate, and 2 Grammy Award nominations. He's a contributor to the Wall Street Journal and 8 encyclopedias. Mr. Hasse has lectured on jazz and American music in 20 countries on 6 continents. Let's welcome John Hasse. Next is Richard Burgess. He's Director of Marketing and Sales for Smithsonian Folkways. He's author of the book, The Art of Music Production. He's been a major label recording artist and studio musician himself and a recording engineer. He produced the first 2 albums by Spandau Ballet and has mixed or remixed recordings by Thomas Dolby, Lou Reed, and Youssou N'Dour. He holds a PhD in entrepreneurship and cultural studies. In addition, he was educated at Berklee College of Music in Boston and the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. Along with John Hasse, he had quite a hand in the production of Jazz, the Smithsonian Anthology. He served as co-executive producer and played an influential role in influencing and directing the 8-year project, which came to its fruition just ahead of last year's Jazz Appreciation Month. He was also on the team of fact-checkers for the project and proofread the 200-page hardcover book that accompanies the anthology. The 6-CD collection opens with a rendition of the 1899 Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin. Recording, of course, was not available from 1899, and so there's a later performance to start off the collection. But in addition, the collection has a 1917 recording by the original Dixieland Band and closes with a 2003 piece by trumpeter Thomas Stanko of Poland. Some selections in the anthology have sparked controversy, but in turn raised new discussion over what jazz music is and can and should be. I'll have Richard speak to some of the controversies and other topics quite soon. He lectures internationally on record production and the music business. Please welcome Richard Burgess. We're also in the good company of Felix Contreras, my friend and colleague. Felix is a reporter and producer for NPR's Arts Desk, specializing in jazz, world music, and Latino arts and culture. He's also the co-host of NPR's new web-based program about Latin alternative music, Alt Latino. He's reported a series of stories on the financial challenges facing aging jazz musicians. He's also a part-time jazz musician. Felix plays Afro-Cuban percussion with various jazz and Latin bands, and we'll also get to hear him with his trio later in the program. Please welcome Felix Contreras. Gentlemen, we're here to talk about jazz and cultural diplomacy, and I'd like to start things off talking about the music itself. Jazz from its inception was an amalgam of European song structures, African rhythms, call and response, wending its way to improvisation. And I'd like if each of you can comment on what first constituted jazz music as its own art form. John, start.
Well, there's a controversy about where jazz did originate, but New Orleans probably has the best claim on that. It is, in fact, as Richard said, such a cultural bouillabaisse of different cultures and different musics, and there were all these aspects of the culture that helped create the music we call jazz, out of marches, out of hymns, out of ragtime, out of blues, out of work songs. And we don't know when the first jazz was played, possibly in the first decade of the century, but we know at that time people were taking rags, piano rags, and taking liberties with them, improvising, embellishing them, so much so that Scott Joplin and his rags in the first decade of the 20th century had to urge people not to fake them, not to play them fast. He wanted them played as written. So the music was being formed, and in 1917, the first records widely considered to be jazz records were made.
Thank you. Richard?
Well, I can't really add much to that in terms of the origins, but what I can say is that one of the reasons we don't know much about that early period is because it was very early in the history of the recording industry, and jazz was not taken very seriously. No vernacular musics were taken very seriously, apart from extremely popular music, and obviously there was a racial element at play too, and the controversy that Walter alluded to, one of the controversies was that the original Dixieland Jazz Band was white, and yet it was the first group recorded. That doesn't really detract from their abilities. In fact, it was widely considered to be a great record. And but nonetheless, it's highly likely that the reason the first jazz record recorded was not by African Americans was because of some kind of inherent racism in the industry at the time.
Thank you. Felix? Borrow Richard's.
1, 2, there we go.
Okay, good.
The radio guy doesn't know how to turn the mic on. Yeah, right. One of the things that always strikes me when I'm studying the history of jazz and history of Latin music, Afro-Cuban music, and Afro-Caribbean music is that initially New Orleans was considered the northernmost port of Cuba, and that there was a lot of cultural exchange going on between the Caribbean and New Orleans. And so all of that, when you look closely into the history of the origins of jazz, the syncopation is there, and the syncopation has some roots in the Afro-Caribbean cultures.
Very good. I now turn to talking a bit about jazz as cultural diplomacy. Former cultural ambassadors on tours for the State Department include Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Benny Goodman, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Byrd. And John, I'd like you to talk about how those trips enhanced an understanding of American culture, but also it inspired artists to not only appreciate American creativity, but lead to fashioning and appreciating their own homegrown artists. I know I'm asking a lot.
The tours, particularly those for the State Department, that started in 1956 when Dave Brubeck crossed into East Berlin and went to East Germany, really electrified people in so many countries. They had been smuggling in recordings of American jazz. They'd been listening, in some cases furtively, to broadcasts of the Voice of America. But to actually hear these musicians and see them and sometimes get to meet them was just absolutely electrifying. And you can go today to Russia and talk to people who were there in 1971 when Ellington came, and what a jolt it gave them and the music scene. And you hear stories of how they used to make bootleg records and pass them around on this incredibly flammable, fragile material. But this is how much American jazz was valued in so many countries. And it wasn't just American jazz. Jazz was valued because it spoke to fundamental human values like freedom and freedom of expression, individuality, creativity, innovation. And so it resonated with so many people.
And cooperation as well. I mean, the fact of jazz ensembles working together, producing a unified body of work, producing a single song together is also, would you not agree, also a part of those values?
Yes, and people creating new art across divides. Today you could take a bassist from Brazil, a pianist from Poland, a trumpeter from Turkey, and a violinist from Vietnam. They may not speak each other's spoken language, but they could instantly communicate in the international language of jazz. It's become kind of a musical Esperanto.
Thank you. I wondered if I could beseech upon you, John, to also discuss a bit about Charlie Byrd and Stan Getz. This marks the 50th year anniversary of the release of Jazz Samba, which in fact was something both men experienced and carried back from Brazil to this country on one of those tours.
Yes, Charlie Byrd in particular had toured about 15 or 16 Latin American countries as a goodwill ambassador for the State Department, absorbing rhythms where he went, but particularly in Brazil and in Rio, and came back to Washington and was a pioneer in the United States of introducing this bossa nova, literally in Portuguese, new tendency, an amalgam of samba and jazz and perhaps some other elements, introducing this into the U.S. soundscape, if you will, and it had a dramatic impact. I imagine Richard and Felix have some thoughts on that too.
Well, you know, I'm always amazed at just how adaptable. One of the things I do now is I do an online program where we're looking at how Latin music today and Latin musicians today are incorporating influences from all over the world, really, and incorporating it into music. So we play, you know, electronica, we play hip hop, we play rock, mixed in with traditional cultures around Latin America. And even now, Brazil is still one of the most creative Latin American countries where people are just doing amazing things with the rhythms that are inherent there, that are rhythms that are natural there. Going back to bossa nova and including some of that, but then just when you look at the size of the country and all the different cultural aspects that are there and all the indigenous rhythms, they're still in discovering a lot of the rhythms and mixing it in a very interesting way. And it goes back to like that album, the Jazz Samba album, no doubt. And even as a musician, when I'm playing with people, you know, it's like that's the one, again, that's one of the languages, one of the Latin rhythms that just about everybody knows. You can always strike up with, no matter from what country, you can play a bossa nova and everybody gets along.
Thank you, Felix.
And the samba, correct.
I'd like to talk more now a bit about some of the jazz musicians that we can all just point to who were either inspired by American jazz or who certainly from that inspiration created their own music. I mean, I'm just going to, it's sort of a name-dropping Rorschach test, as it were. I'm going to name a couple myself. The jazz guitarist Lionel Lueke is from Benin, a country that doesn't have a tradition of guitar, and he was found on the streets of Paris playing and was invited by musicians to come to this country, and he interacted with the trumpeter Terrence Blanchard and he's since recorded with Herbie Hancock, and now he's doing World Jazz Festivals all by himself. I mean, with carrying his own bands in the fray. I wondered. I'm sure you all have a much longer list than my introduction.
Well, one of the things when we were putting the jazz, you can tell I'm the director of marketing and sales, right? You just got to do it. When we were putting the jazz anthology together, the international element was extremely important to us. Now, there's only 6 CDs and there's more than 100 years of jazz, so we couldn't, be comprehensive in terms of international musicians. But the album ends, as Walter alluded to before, with Tomasz Stanko, the Polish musician, who was one of the musicians. He actually learned about jazz and learned jazz from Gray Market cassettes and from Voice of America broadcasts. So that's a great story. But there are a lot of jazz. The first international musician that is on the set is Django Reinhardt from 1937. But we have Marshall Salal from Algiers, Nguyen Ly from Vietnam, Abdullah Ibrahim, South Africa, Ira Carey from Cuba. Weather Report has Joe Zawinul as one of its leaders from Austria, Toshiko Akiyoshi from Japan, Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin's from the UK, obviously Astrid Gilberto and Jobim and João Gilberto from Brazil, Machito from Cuba. So, the list goes on and on. I mean, it almost immediately that jazz went out into the world, it started to come back to us. People just, it resonated with people. And one of the things I wanted to say before, too, there's something fundamentally democratic about jazz. Most other musics, classical music and martial music and so on and so forth, there's always a leader, there's an arrangement, there's an orchestration, everybody's following the leader, or it's composer-driven music, whatever. Jazz is very much a performer-driven music. It's very improvised. The performers themselves make a lot of the decisions that happen, and I think there's something it's very much a people's music, and I think that's what appealed. And by the way, I wouldn't be in America if it wasn't for jazz. I was born in England. I grew up in New Zealand, and I suddenly became aware when I was very young, under the age of 10, that all the music that suddenly excited me, that I was attracted to, was American music, and gradually started to pin down what it was that intrigued me, and wound up going to Berkeley to study jazz, and that's what brought me here in the first place.
Thank you. Felix?
One of the things that one of the musicians that first comes to mind, and besides my passion is the Afro. I always say, like, if I can invent a time machine, I would like to go back to New York just after the Second World War, up to like 55, when the Afro-Cuban musicians were creating music at the Palladium and right there and right around the corner, 52nd Street. Charlie Parker and all of the other heroes were there. That immediately comes to mind. But the other one that comes to mind right now is somebody I discovered probably within the last 10 years. There's a pianist from Spain. His name is Chano Dominguez. And he's a pianist, and he does sort of a flamenco style on the piano, lots of fast, kind of percussive runs. On his second album, I think it was, that he did some interpretations of Thelonious Monk that sounded like Monk was born in the south of Spain, And that always triggered a respect for just how influential, again, just what we're talking about, but how it can be incorporated, and how the Monk's music, it does really have a lot in common with the mesh that became flamenco music. So I would mention, just off the top of my head, Chano Dominguez.
Mm-hmm. Actually, before I go to you, John, a couple more names came to my mind. There's Anat Cohen, who's a jazz clarinetist, and she's from Tel Aviv. She's been recording several albums with several different groups in this country. Her younger brother, I believe, is Avishai Cohen, who's in great demand in New York on the New York jazz scene as a trumpeter. And then there was another person I wanted to mention. I think I'll go to you now, John.
Well, I think of Abdullah Ibrahim, whom Richard mentioned, who's on the anthology, born in South Africa as Dollar Brand, and was taken under the wing by Duke Ellington in the early 60s and encouraged. And if you listen to his track on this anthology, you wouldn't mistake it for an American pianist. It definitely is African, and in his case, South African, which brings up another point that in many parts of the world, jazz has taken on local and national flavors and sounds and identities. I like to draw a parallel between jazz and the English language. English language emerged from this island nation of England and went all around the world, and today it's spoken in many places in many different dialects. Indian English is very different than South African, which is very different than Boston English. Same with jazz. You would never mistake South African jazz for American, Cuban jazz for Brazilian, and that's one of the wonderful things about it. It keeps growing and unfolding as it mixes with other forms, national forums and other kinds of music.
Thanks. The name came back to me. You were talking about pianists, and Felix was talking about Cuba. Gonzalo Rubalcaba from Cuba has brought to the world Cuban classical music and jazz, and he's quite in demand himself, making several recordings and touring all over the world. I want to steer the conversation now a bit to Washington, D.C. as a music city. And I'll start with you, Richard, because I don't think a lot of people, perhaps in this audience or listening to us right now, realize that the recording industry in its nascence was to a great deal founded right here in Washington, D.C. And particularly, I'd like you to touch on Columbia Records, which I had very little knowledge of before.
Right. Well, many people don't realize that Columbia Records was actually named after the District of Columbia. It was started initially by Edison. It was the Columbia Phonograph Company, and it started right here about just a few blocks from here. And then many of the improvements, Edison kind of neglected the phonograph for a while because he was kind of occupied with electric light and things like seemed a little more important to him. So Alexander Graham Bell and his brother Chichester Bell and Charles Sumner Tainter did a bunch of improvements on the phonograph, and they called theirs the graphophone. And then Emil Berliner came along and invented the flat disc, and he was also in D.C. So the Bells and Tainter were in D.C., Edison was in D.C., and Berliner was in D.C. So the whole scene really started out of here. And in fact, one of the very first producers, a guy called Fred Gaisberg, was also based out of D.C. So the first 20 or 30 years was all D.C.-based, and Columbia Records, of course, is the oldest record label. It was eventually bought by CBS, which was eventually eaten up by Sony, but it still exists.
Thanks. I'd also like to ask John, who I understand has begun working on a book. At least, well, yes, you've begun working on a book on the Erdogan brothers, or Washington as a music city involving the Erdogan brothers. These two Turkish brothers were the founders of Atlantic Records, something that I think a lot of us know about, involving Aretha Franklin and all of her great records. But the two brothers were mining Washington for music and produced concerts both at the Turkish Embassy and the National Press Club, and broke new ground in the 1930s. I'll let you take it from there.
The Erdogans moved to Washington in 1934 when their father became the second ambassador of the young Republic of Turkey to Washington, and he was ambassador for 10 years. And Ahmet wrote later, when he came to Washington, he thought he was coming to the land of jazz. And he went downtown to the big record store and asked for some jazz. They didn't have any. But the nice lady behind the counter said, you want to go over to 7th and T by the Howard Theater. So he went over there and he found what he was looking for in the African-American section of town. And he started haunting record stores, and then he started haunting the Howard Theater and inviting Duke Ellington, his players, people like Sidney Bechet, great musicians who were coming to town, to come to the Turkish embassy, come up to the 3rd floor, which was the private residence, and jam. And there's these wonderful pictures and stories of these musicians having interracial jazz sessions at a time when that just wasn't done in Washington. Washington was still a southern town, and it just wasn't done. They even rented first the Jewish Community Center because no one else would let them do an interracial jazz concert, and then the National Press Club auditorium. They had interracial audiences, interracial musicians on stage, and they really did their part to help beat down the color barrier in Washington before they went on to make such a difference in recorded music history.
Before I go to you, Felix, I just wanted to mention that, hold on to that thought. I know that we all appreciate the fact that Duke Ellington was born here, but it is a much richer music scene than simply his birthplace. I just wanted to mention that in passing,
I grew up. I was born and raised in California, and as a teenager, as I started to discover jazz, certain things started to pop up, and like the Ramsey Lewis album, Live at the Bohemian Caverns. Bohemian Caverns. There was a Miles Davis album, Live Evil, that was recorded at a place called the Cellar Doors. So later on, I was thrilled when I moved here to be part of a city that had such a strong history, and I love talking to people who've been here for a long time, like one guy in particular, Rusty Hassan, who does a show on WPFW, because he has a ton of stories. And when I first moved here and met him, he was telling me about like how the musicians used to hang out right out where the Howard Theater is right now. He would, as a young man, he would just go there, and he met Art Blakey. I mean, you could see Miles Davis or Thelonious Monk hanging out on the corner, which always blew my mind. Because when I drive through there now, I try to imagine. But it was just, it's quite a thrill. And then to know that, Dr. Billy Taylor was born and raised here, and he had his own little bit of history here. So yeah, it's pretty significant here.
I also wanted to mention the Howard Theater has just reopened, and Bohemian Caverns has been reopened for quite some time. We're going to have to wind down. I'm just going to ask a bit of a closing set of questions, and one is about education in the future, and that is, keep your answers brief, obviously, but Felix, if you could talk a little bit about how technology has expanded access to all music, and particularly jazz, for younger generations?
Yeah, that's one thing that we're seeing quite a bit of. And, when you read articles and people say, well, jazz is dying out, I strongly disagree, and I think that it's the technology that's spreading it across, and the access to it, and the amount of information that's available online, either through the Smithsonian, the oral histories at NPR. We have, I was going to give a plug that the NPR Jazz Profiles does have an entire chapter on DC as a jazz city. So you can go to npr.org/music and find that as well. And a personal anecdote too, very quickly, is that when I'm done here, I'm going back to Silver Spring at El Golfo Restaurant. The Tacoma Middle School Jazz Band is performing there as a fundraiser. And some of the kids that I sort of tutor are going to be playing there. So it's not going to die. It's not going away, and it's loved and supported still to this day by young people.
I'm going to jump over to you, Richard.
Yeah, come on.
Well, I can tell you the sixth CD on this set is the last 10 to 20 years of jazz and around the world, actually. And honestly, it was the most difficult CD to put together, because for every single artist on that CD, we could have really chosen one of another 5 or more. It's a very, very vibrant jazz scene out there. It's not necessarily on the radio. That may be an issue. Obviously mass media wants to play things that are incredibly popular, but at the same time we're seeing technology move in a favorable direction, where you have streaming audio, music on demand, and so on and so forth. So I'm extremely optimistic for the future of jazz. With regard to education, I do want to give Folkways a plug, folkways.si.edu/jazz. We have a number of educational tools there. We call them tools for teaching, and they're all free. We're always trying to promote things for teachers to be able to use.
Richard, I'd also like you to mention your participation in this interactive jazz band device on that website. There's something, I think it's called the Mixer.
Right, we put up a mixer. We did a Smithsonian Folkways jazz quintet, and there's a mixer, so kids can go in and they can solo the drums, solo the bass, solo the trumpet, the saxophone, the piano, so on and so forth.
So you can hear his drumming.
Yeah. Somebody had to do it. But we're really just trying to get stuff out there to get kids intrigued, something that they can play with, something interactive. We've got interactive timelines and things like that, but anything we can do to introduce the idea, especially because we know that elementary school and middle school and high school teachers are pretty strapped for cash.
And finally, John, you're involved in middle school jazz programs, and how important is it to get music to younger generations, particularly children at that age, either to foster appreciation for the music, or even to get them involved in playing it themselves?
It's terrifically important because by the time most students are in high school, their tastes have started to gel. They're listening to what all their friends are listening to on their iPods or boom boxes, and you need to get them before that age. Also in the United States, middle school is the highest age at which students who take a music course are still taking a general music course, not choir, band, orchestra, but music, and that's a course where the teachers can introduce jazz. To that effort, our website, smithsonianjazz.org, has 31 classes aimed at middle school students and teachers, grades 5 through 8, and their activities of music of Quincy Jones and Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington and Miles Davis. And this website also includes many, many oral histories. The program's supervised by my colleague Ken Kimmery, and lots of information on Jazz Appreciation Month. Where is Joanne Stevens, who runs that program? There she is.
There she is. Lastly, give Joanne a big hand. Yes, thank you. Lastly, John, as we prepare to leave this stage, I'd like you briefly to talk about the appreciation, the way in which younger and older kids have listened in on your lectures, because you've traveled to 6 continents on behalf of the State Department, lecturing on jazz. Just give us a little glimpse.
Couple incidents from Africa. Once in South Africa, a group of teenage boys had come, I think, an hour and a half by bus each way. They lived in the townships, no running water, just extremely poor. They sat there in the front row, and when I played a recording of Louis Armstrong singing Hello, Dolly from 1964, they started singing along. They knew the words. And this is the power of someone like Louis Armstrong to transcend generations, time, space, language. And then both in Zambia and Kenya, played a video of Louis Armstrong doing Dinah from 1933. And a couple of young men in each place came up and one said, life will never be the same. And a musician in the other country said, you changed my life forever. And I took that as a compliment to Armstrong, of course. And, the power of this music, it's still very strong. And I was just thrilled to see that in 3 different parts of Africa.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. Thank you, John Hasse, Richard Burgess, and Felix. Let's all give them a hand.
Thanks to that wonderful panel. For those of you who are just joining the webcast, I'm Marc Pachter, Interim Director of the National Museum of American History. I've got to add one comment. The only thing that hasn't been included in this program, or one of the important things, you can't do everything, is a tribute to one of my favorite forms, which I think of as jazz for the feet, tap dance. And we began our Jazz Appreciation Month this year with tap dance improvisation, and it had the same effects. And young people were coming on stage and jamming with their feet. So remember how really pervasive jazz is for all parts, not only of the world, but of the body. So now I welcome you to the second half of the program in what we call America's House of Jazz. We certainly get to call it that today, here on the stage of our Warner Brothers Theater at the American History Museum. You have heard how music creates a miraculous bond, transforming differences into understanding, and certainly that is why the arts play a wonderful role in diplomacy. Here on the stage, we are proud to showcase our newest jazz acquisition, a guitar belonging to jazz guitarist Johnny Smith, and I'm told it was his favorite guitar. Mr. Smith could not be here, but we thank him for his generous donation to the National Collections. He's well known for his composition Walk, Don't Run, which was re-recorded by the Ventures in 1960 when the world was young, or at least I was. And the song hit number 2 on Billboard's singles chart. This is a namesake guitar, the Johnny Smith model, first made by Gibson in the 1960s. So jazz is also about stuff. We believe that jazz music is the soundtrack of American history. And this afternoon you will hear from Afro Blue, the Howard University a cappella group, the Felix Contreras trio, vocalist Lena Seikaly, and a quintet from our own Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra, known, not surprisingly, as SJMO. Founded in 1990 with an appropriation from the U.S. Congress in recognition of the importance of jazz in American culture, the SJMO presents an annual concert series in Washington. It tours nationally and internationally to showcase the development of American jazz. That's like a traveling gallery because music has its own forms of continuous presentation. The orchestra performed at the Pyramids of Giza and in the Cairo Opera House. This past May, SJMO embarked on a U.S. Department of State-sponsored tour to 3 cities in Russia as part of the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission, and their next stop is to Ethiopia in July. Please welcome Ken Kimbrey, who serves as executive producer of the SJMO, as well as the band's percussionist.
Okay, we're ready for some music. I think that's what we're here for. One thing I do want to tell you, as part of our collections, which Marc had mentioned, is the oral history collection here, which is something we're very proud of. And actually, within the bio of this group coming up, the first group, it so happens that 2 of these NEA masters are also documented. So let me give you a quick bio of the 4 groups that are coming up here, and we will get the music running here. Afro Blue, Howard University's premier vocal ensemble, was formed by Professor Kenesha Miller in the spring of 2002, singing music in the style of Lambrick, Hendricks, and Ross. And I should say John Hendricks and Annie Ross have been documented in live oral history interviews, which you can find on our website. They're fantastic interviews, very insightful. I charge you to go there and explore. Also the New York Voices in Take 6, while adding their own unique sound. Afro Blue has often been described as a vocal big band. Since its inception, the dynamic jazz choir has quickly gained national attention. If you were watching TV, the period of time between September 19th and December 5th of last year, you might have seen a glimpse of this ensemble here on the show, which was called Sing Off. They actually made the final 16 of these a cappella groups, and it's quite exciting to see this ensemble there sing, which you will see here shortly. Following that is our colleague, once again, Felix Contreras, which you got an opportunity to hear from. He's a fantastic percussionist, had an opportunity playing with him, and you'll be dazzled with not only his wonderful insights of the music, but actually his playing on conga drums there and this wonderful trio. Following that is Lena Seikaly and the orchestra, the Masterworks Orchestra, will back her. She's a fresh voice on the national jazz scene from Washington, D.C., a longtime student of music. She began her classical training at the age of 4 with piano and continued with classical voice in her teens. Went on to complete a BM in classical vocal performance at University of Maryland School of Music. In 2009, she was a participant at the Betty Carter Jazz Ahead program over at the Kennedy Center, and also an artist in residence over at the Strathmore in Rockville, Maryland. And closing out this, and one last note there on that, I should say, if you want to see her in extended performance, Blues Alley this coming Sunday, she will be featuring the music of Ella Fitzgerald with the Alan Baylock Orchestra, just a wonderful orchestra I highly recommend that. And closing out this afternoon will be the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Quintet, which is actually extraction from the full orchestra, which is a 17-piece orchestra. And we're going to play a little samplings of Ellington and his ventures beyond the borders of this country and what his return and what he envisioned musically that experience to be. So without further ado, please welcome Afro Blue.
Good afternoon. The first piece we're going to do for you is simply entitled Martin's Theme in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King, written by Mr. Jimmy Owens. And in the middle, we'll actually include a little bit of a lesser-known speech, which will be read by Miss Imani Grace Cooper. Dum 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 oppression dum 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 to be strong to deal with realities of segregation was our Martin taught us to be strong, changing thought and behavior. He spoke of love everlasting, and the power of love, the kind that comes from God. Only wisdom was evident in each speech he gave. We learned not to be afraid. He challenged everyone to find the strength to stand and fight for what we know is right. Born in May. Is he loved by hatred, jealousy?
Now there is a final reason I think that Jesus says, love your enemies. It is this, that love has within it a redemptive power. And there is a power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them. And they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways at the beginning. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period. Just keep loving them. Just keep being friendly to them. And eventually, they will break down under the load. That's love, you see. There's something about love that's creative and builds up. There's something about hate that tears down and is destructive. So love your enemies.
Martin Luther King. Next piece will feature Miss Shakira Rogers. We'll be singing Too Marvelous for Words, and Shakira actually wrote a vocalese to a J.J. Johnson trombone solo, so we hope that you like that. And it actually also marries elements of an arrangement that was done by Joe Williams, and this was done by our director, Miss Connetra Miller. Ba-dum dum, dum ba-dum dum, ba-dum dum, ba-dum dum, dum ba-dum dum, ba-dum dum,
You're just too marvelous, too marvelous for words, like glorious, glamorous, and that old standby amorous. It's all too wonderful. I'll never find the words that say enough, tell enough. I mean, they just aren't swell enough. You're much, too much, and just so very, very in Webster's dictionary. And so I'm borrowing a love song from the birds, just to tell you that you're marvelous. You're much too marvelous for words, even as I sit right here. I'm filled up with excitement and a little bit of fear, 'cause I don't know what life has in store, but it's okay, 'cause I know that you want me to be nothing but happy, so we can grow old together. We carry all the memories of our precious moments. People can say what they want, but our love will last till the end of all time. And I'm so glad that you're mine. And in the middle of all these feelings that I'm having, I can't get my mind off you, and it's hard to think of anything else. Hey, that's my phone, by the way, I know it's you. I think those goosebumps are returning. You are much too much, and you're just so very, very too ever be in Webster's dictionary. And so I'm borrowing a love song from the birds, just to tell you that you're marvelous, to tell you that you're wonderful. You are much too marvelous for words, for words. You're much too marvelous for words,
For words.
for words.
Thank you.
As we, can you hear me on this? As we start to get set up a little bit. As we get set up a little bit, one of the things we're going to do is we want to talk very briefly, going to give you the thumbnail sketch on what it is that we do, and we play a mixture of, we play music that's been come to be called Latin jazz, and it's primarily an Afro-Caribbean-based music. And I'll give you the thumbnail sketch, a very quick thumbnail sketch on what this music is about. And during one of the legacies of the slave trade here in this part of the world is that in this country, the slaves were not allowed to keep their drums. And that's what, and in the rest of the Caribbean and in parts of South America, they were. So that's why there is a rich rhythmic heritage in Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, even Afro-Peruvian music has started to become very popular. And again, back here in this country, the short version is because they didn't have drums, they've figured other ways to, discovered other ways to make music. That's where the call and response came from. Somebody made reference to that earlier, the call and response. And then the short version is it developed into, you know, the blues, the gospel, jazz, and all of the above. So what we're going to do is we're going to play two songs. We're going to play a mambo. The first one's called Philadelphia Mambo, or Philly Mambo, and it's written by Tito Puente. And Tito Puente was a band leader percussionist out of New York, whose birthday was just this past Friday. He passed away about 8 years ago. And he was an arranger, he was a percussionist. He was, again, one of those ambassadors that we talk about that took Latin music and jazz all over the world. He was very, very popular and one of my heroes. So we're going to do Philadelphia Mambo. And then we're going to do, and that music is the result of some of the stuff that I talked about earlier, that whole post-World War II era mixture of Afro-Cuban music and jazz. And then we're going to do a Wayne Shorter composition called Footprints. And we're going to play it in a way that changes every time we play it. So I'm not really sure how it's going to turn out this time, where it's going to end up, but you know, we always have fun with it. But it emphasizes the African rhythm and the African aspect. It's a song written in 3, but we do it in 6/8 so that we can explore the African roots of what's in that music. So that's what we're going to do. Thank you. I'm sorry. Eddie Eatman on bass. And David Schulman on violin.
afternoon, everyone. My name is Lena Seikaly. I'm so honored to be up here sharing the stage with such wonderful musicians, Afro Blue, Felix's group, and the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra. As the daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian immigrants to the United States, I grew up in a very bicultural household, and a very musical one at that. This is a house where the music of Stan Getz and Ella Fitzgerald sat perfectly alongside Feiruz and Kulthum and other wonderful Arabic musicians. And growing up, as I developed my musical tastes, I realized that improvisation was something that really drew me to certain types of music, and so naturally I fell very much in love with jazz in music school. And today I'm so inspired by how jazz has transcended borders, cultures, generations, just everything. And in any case, as a nod to the international community here in DC, we're going to start with a beautiful tune by DC's very own Duke Ellington. This is Mood Indigo.
Just a soul who's bluer than blue can be. When I get that mood indigo, I could lay me down and die. I always get that mood indigo since my baby said goodbye. And in the evening when lights are low, I'm so lonesome I could cry, because there ain't nobody who cares about me. I'm just a soul who's bluer than blue can be. when I get that mood in the go, I could lay me down and die.
Thank you so much. Tom Williams on trumpet. Well, continuing with the theme of cross-cultural appreciation, we're going to do a beautiful tune by Antonio Carlos Jobim of Brazil. This is Triste.
Triste é viver na solidão, na dor cruel de uma paixão. Triste é saber que ninguém pode viver de ilusão, que nunca vai ser, nunca vai dar. Num sonhador tem que acordar. Tua beleza, avião, demais para um pobre coração que para te ver passar só para me maltratar. Triste é viver na solidão. Oh, triste é viver na solidão, na dor cruel de uma paixão. Triste é saber que ninguém pode viver de ilusão, que nunca vai ser, nunca vai dar. Num sonhador tem que acordar. Tua beleza, avião, demais para um pobre coração. Oh, que para te ver passar só para me maltratar. Triste é viver na solidão. Oh, tua beleza, avião, demais para um pobre coração. Oh, que para te ver passar só para me maltratar. Triste é viver na solidão, Thank you so much. We're going to end with a staple from the Great American Songbook. This is This Can't Be Love. This can't be love because I feel so well. No sobs, no sorrows, no sighs. This can't be love, I get no dizzy spell. My head is not in the skies, and my heart does not stand still. Just hear it beat, this is too sweet to be love. This can't be love because I feel so well. I love to look in your eyes. This can't be love because I feel so well. No sobs, no sorrows, no sighs. This can't be love, I get no dizzy spell. My head is not in the skies, and my heart does not stand still. Just hear it beat. This is too sweet to be love. Oh, this can't be love. I feel so well. I love to look in. Buddy, buddy, bum, shadoo, badoo, bib, bum, shadoo, bib, the oh. Shoom, badoo, badoo, bib, up, shadoo, the oh. Shoo, badoo, badoo, the bob, sweet, bum, shadoo, badoo, 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 oh. Shoo, badoo, bye, shoo, badoo, 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 oh. Shoo, badoo, 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 she do that. She you bo 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 bip 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 we all swear but it bo bo oh. Shoo badoo bip, shbabadoo bay, shoo baboo bip bo beep dee bum shadoo yo bop do day, shadoo bop day, do da da sweet dee beep bum shadoo yo bop bop do it do be why. Shoo badoo bop be do we bop 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 do it it. Shee bop shimmy ah shoo but it it. Shoo bop it shimmy bop dee la bo but it do bay. Bum to do ba da ba dee, shoo ba 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 ba, shoo ba do ba do ba, shoo ba dee ba dee ba, shoo ba do ba, shoo ba dee dee ba ba do ba we oh. This can't be love, I feel so well. No sobs, no sorrows, no sighs. This can't be love, I get no dizzy spell. My head is not in the skies, and my heart does not stand still. Just hear it beat. This is too sweet. this is too sweet to be love. This can't be love because I feel so well. I love to look, how I love to look, how I love to look in your eyes.
Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You know, we will continue for our performance, our section of the performance by focusing on some of the music of, the Smithsonian, as has been mentioned before, houses, the archives of many great composers, including, of course, including Duke Ellington. And so we chose, we had a little caucus and decided to choose some of Duke's music. Duke Ellington, traveling the world over, was influenced greatly by cultures from other parts of the world. He was commissioned to do some music for the centennial celebration of Libya, the Liberian suite which he composed in 1947. He also made some tours to Central America in the 1960s and many other tours to Japan and other places. What we would like to perform for you first would be one that is from, he was affected greatly by the artwork of some impressionistic painters, one of which being Degas. There was going to be a movie that was going to be released produced in the late 1960s that never really quite got off the ground. However, Duke composed the music and recorded the music, and it's entitled the Degas Suite. There's some beautiful selections in that and kind of oddly titled. Duke was impressed by the landscape paintings as well as paintings of racetracks, and there's a most gorgeous tune entitled Race, which is not fast, it's a very slow thing. That in my impression of it is probably when the jockey is on the back of the horse and he bonds with this animal, it's very introspective type piece, very quiet, quite the opposite of what you might think of in a race, maybe the moments just prior to the race. The one that we will play for you is one entitled March, the promenade around the ring. This one is kind of loosely remind you maybe of Blues March, but this one once again was written to accompany this film score of the movie that was supposed to feature the artwork of the life of Degas and some other artists. This is entitled March. This next one is inspired by an excursion to the Far East in the 1960s by Ellington, and he and Billy Strayhorn came back and they wrote this suite, making a point not to copy what they heard or saw, but to give their impression of their visit to the Far East. And this one is entitled Isfahan. Thank you so much. You know, on that one, I can almost feel the heat of the desert and the need for something nice and cool. You know, we like to finish our segment in the performance today with one that was inspired by a trip to Central America, to Latin America, and this one is entitled it's from the Latin American Suite, and this was aptly entitled Latin American Sunshine. Thank you. Once again, the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra and other fine groups, Afro Blue. And you know something, I just met this young lady, and I'm drawing a blank on what her name is. Just say it nice and loud. Lena. You know, one of them names one of the people that only needs one name. And the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra. You know, we'd like to welcome you to a reception immediately following this. I understand there will be groceries there. You know, no, I'm hungry, man. You know, so it's on the second floor, the west wing, immediately following the performance. Thank you once again.